What if I told you that an entire army, thousands of men, continued fighting for a war that had already ended? What if I told you that for decades, they lived, starved, and bled on an island forgotten by history, refusing to believe Japan had surrendered? You're about to hear a story so haunting, it challenges what it means to obey, to believe, and to survive. Because what happened on this remote island wasn't just war. It was a psychological prison, one that trapped men inside a lie so deep, they'd kill anyone who told them the truth. If you think you know the end of World War II, you're wrong. This was the island of no return. As the final days of World War II faded, Japan's empire crumbled under fire. Cities burned, soldiers surrendered, and the world exhaled. But deep in the Pacific, one small, forgotten island stood apart from surrender. It was thick with jungle, soaked with rain, and buzzing with mosquitoes. To the outside world, it was nothing, a dot on a map. But to the men stranded there, it became something else entirely, a world frozen in time, a place where duty outlived the war itself. In 1944, as the Allied forces pushed across the Pacific, Japan sent hundreds of men to remote outposts to slow the American advance. Lubang Island, tiny, dense, and strategically unimportant, was one of them. Among the soldiers sent was a young intelligence officer named Hiroo Onoda, trained in guerrilla warfare and psychological operations. His mission was simple: defend the island, destroy enemy supply lines, and never surrender. Those were his orders, and they were orders that would become his prison. When the Allied forces invaded in early 1945, the Japanese defense collapsed in days. Most soldiers were killed or captured, but Onoda and a handful of men disappeared into the jungle. They vowed to fight on, to live and die for the emperor. Days turned to months, months turned to years, and then radio silence. In August 1945, Japan surrendered. The atomic bombs had fallen. The emperor himself had spoken. But Onoda and his men never heard it, or refused to believe it. Leaflets were dropped over Lubang announcing the war's end. Newspapers fell from planes. Loudspeakers echoed peace messages across the jungle. But to Onoda, they were lies. He believed the Allies forged them to lure out the remaining soldiers. Japan can never surrender, he told his men. We must remain loyal. And so they did. They raided villages for food. They burned rice fields to disrupt enemy supplies. They ambushed local police, believing they were Allied scouts. The islanders learned to fear the shadows in the jungle, because to them, these men were ghosts of a dead war, appearing from nowhere, striking, and vanishing again. By 1950, the world had changed beyond recognition. Japan had rebuilt. The United States occupied it peacefully. But in the jungles of Lubang, Onoda and his shrinking group still fought. They watched planes fly overhead and thought they were American bombers. They found magazines showing modern Tokyo and thought they were fake propaganda. They even read articles saying the war is over and called them enemy lies. It was no longer just survival. It was faith, twisted, absolute, unbreakable faith. By 1959, Onoda's small unit was reduced to 2 men. Each time the others were found or killed, he buried them like soldiers, never doubting that one day Japan would return for them. In their minds, they were heroes holding the final line of the empire. But to the world, they were ghosts, men living inside a hallucination of loyalty. In the early 1970s, strange stories began circulating. Japanese soldiers still fighting the war on a remote island. It sounded impossible, like a myth. But journalists, adventurers, and even the Japanese government became curious. Expeditions were sent to search for the so-called lost holdouts. One by one, a few were discovered, emaciated, wild-eyed, still carrying 1940s rifles. But Onoda, he was still out there, 28 years after the war had ended. In 1974, a young Japanese traveler named Norio Suzuki set out on a mission. He told friends, "I'm going to look for Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order." And incredibly, he found him. Suzuki called out in the jungle, "Onoda-san!" From the shadows, a man stepped forward, lean, hardened, uniform still intact. He pointed his rifle. Suzuki raised his hands and said, "Japan's war is over. Please come home." Onoda shook his head. "If Japan truly surrendered, my commander will tell me himself." Word reached Japan, and the government tracked down Onoda's former commander, now an elderly bookseller in Tokyo. They flew him to Lubang. When Onoda saw him, he saluted sharply, tears in his eyes. The old commander read the final order. "The war is over. You are relieved of all duties." For the first time in nearly 30 years, Onoda lowered his rifle. He returned to Japan in March 1974, a living fossil of the past. Tokyo erupted in shock. Crowds cheered, but others whispered, "How could he not have known?" Reporters called him the man who refused to surrender. But for Onoda, it wasn't pride, it was loss. He said quietly, "We were taught to die, not to doubt." Onoda's story wasn't unique. Across the Pacific, dozens of Japanese soldiers lived for decades after the war, hiding in jungles across the Philippines, Indonesia, and Guam. Each believed the same lie: Japan could never fall. But Onoda's survival became the symbol of an empire's ghost, a reminder of what happens when duty replaces truth. He struggled to adapt to modern life. Japan had transformed into a peaceful nation of neon lights and rising technology. The world he fought for no longer existed. He moved to Brazil, lived on a ranch, and tried to find peace in the land. But the jungle never left him. He later said, "I lost 30 years of my life fighting for a world that ended before I knew it." If you've made it this far, think about this. How far would you go to defend something you believed was true? Would you question it if everyone around you said otherwise? Or would you fight like Onoda until the very end, only to discover the truth came too late? This story isn't just about war. It's about the danger of blind obedience. It's about how loyalty, when untethered from truth, can trap even the bravest men inside a cage of their own making. The island of no return wasn't just a place. It was a state of mind. And for thousands like Onoda, the real battle began not in 1945, but the moment peace arrived, and they couldn't believe it. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about history and humanity, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Because stories like this remind us that even in the silence after war, echoes of the past still whisper through forgotten islands and faded uniforms. Leave a comment below. Do you think you could have survived like Onoda did, or would you have questioned the war sooner?